When the wind is from the southward, and the fog comes drifting in, over beach and cliff and meadow, like a ghostly wraith of sin, when Muskeget's hid from vision, and when barely you can trace Dunham's house, or Coffin's dory, or the hand before your face, when the moisture's slowly dripping, and in vain the captains try to keep the sails from mildew, when the bathing suits won't dry, then out the lonely distance comes a sad and ghostly sound. 'Tis the Yoho that is calling, like the baying of a hound.
Welcome to the Nantucket Gam. I'm Annalie Gilbert-Keith, and I'm joined by Thomas Parrish.
Hello.
And Adam DeLogue.
Hi.
We are members of the Visitor Operations team at the Nantucket Historical Association, and in each episode, one of us goes on a research blitz, pulling facts and stories out of the archives to explore the fascinating history of our island. Then we'll invite a guest to join our GAM to understand how the past continues to shape the modern history and future of the island. This month, we're talking about Tuckernuck, a small island off the coast of Nantucket. Because Tuckernuck is entirely privately owned, it's a place that a very lucky few actually get to experience. So today, we're hoping to pull back the curtain just a little bit. Later in the episode, we will talk with third-generation Tuckernuck resident Susie Robinson about life on this special island. The poem that you just heard was read by Adam. Would you tell us a little bit about the backstory there?
Sure, Annalie. This poem speaks about the Tuckernuck Yoho, which is the Cape and Islands' only cryptid.
Only known cryptid.
A cryptid beting a sort of a mythical creature. Now,
sort of a Bigfoot or
a Mothman or I don't know. Like, no other examples come to mind immediately.
A Yeti.
Sure, yeah, Yeti, yeah. The Yoho is pretty unique. There's a lot of history behind it. It is sort of hard to pin down, though. It doesn't have a great description. It's amorphous. It doesn't necessarily conform to what you would think of when you think of like a Bigfoot or something like that. There is, however, there's a statue that depicts one possible vision of the Yoho. It has wings. It's got a sort of a gargoyle's face, and it's a marble statue, I believe, that lives outside on Tuckernuck Island. That being said, the story of the Yoho is sort of a story of a creature that is around when there's bad weather, when maybe things go wrong on Tuckernuck.
When the fog comes drifting in.
When the fog comes drifting in, or when, a ship capsizes, or when a kid goes missing for an afternoon and nobody can find them. Certainly sort of you could say like a fisherman's tale. And the connection here is that this week's topic is the history of Tuckernuck. And in many ways, the Yoho is the island's mascot.
And devil.
All right, Thomas, in your research about Tuckernuck, I am very curious to know where the name of the island comes from.
Well, the name Tuckernuck actually comes from an indigenous word that supposedly means loaf of bread. That's essentially what this small 900-acre island is. It's a windswept loaf of an island just off the west coast of Nantucket. It's easily visible from Nantucket, but it remains elusive to many, and only a small portion of Nantucketers have actually been lucky enough to get to enjoy the isolation the island has to offer. But in part because of this, as the legend of the Yoho suggests, Tuckernuck has retained this air of mystery and wonder. Its inaccessibility, the lack of any modern infrastructure, the swirling currents, and its ability to almost change before your eyes due to erosion has caused it to be a place stuck in time, and it's completely captivating and mysterious to many.
So it's currently a part of the county of Nantucket. It's personality is quite separate from Nantucket, I would say, but has it always been sort of this different entity?
Speak on the personality of Tuckernuck for a moment.
It actually hasn't been. When, the English start arriving in what's now the United States, they're colonizing. And they actually decide that Tuckernuck should be part of Martha's Vineyard, not part of Nantucket. When the English arrive in 1659, the first permanent settlement here on Nantucket, they bring with them all these legal and judicial practices. And of course, these are not innate to the people already living here. I mean, the Wampanoag have been here for over 12,000 years, and this is a new way of life. But the English start instituting laws, and they're very eager to punish those who break their laws, like land ownership or property rights. And they were pretty heavy-handed with the punishments as well, with branding, whippings, and even sentences of servitude. But because Tuckernuck was part of Martha's Vineyard, not Nantucket, it allowed Wampanoag to escape the jurisdiction of Nantucket and go to Tuckernuck. This would ultimately inspire the Nantucketers to successfully petition in 1712 the government to include Tuckernuck as part of the county of Nantucket to limit their ability to flee these punitive practices.
I can't imagine that it would have been easy living out there on Tuckernuck. I mean, obviously it was worth it if you wanted to escape the judicial system, but I mean, I can see Tuckernuck from the deck on my house, and I've seen some of the storms that come through there. That's got to be a tough life that these Wampanoag were basically accepting.
I think that's valid. I think life on Tuckernuck would have been tough, but to be honest, we don't have a lot of records of this. So up until the arrival of the English, there were people who lived out there year-round on Tuckernuck as indigenous communities for thousands of years, and we have archaeological evidence to support that. People still find arrowheads and artifacts.
Once Tuckernuck becomes part of Nantucket County, do the English settlers on Nantucket start to go over to this smaller island more frequently?
It appears so. Relatively soon after the 1712 date, when it becomes part of Nantucket, there appears to be a decrease in the population of the Wampanoag, and it becomes evidently a lot more English, and the Wampanoag population eventually ceases to exist in the historic record on Tuckernuck.
What are they doing out there that is keeping them there, bringing them there? Why Tuckernuck?
Yeah, so, I mean, Tuckernuck, in many ways, is kind of a microcosm for Nantucket's own land-based economy. When we think about the history of Nantucket, we tend to think of this predominant historically heavy industry of whaling. But on land, you have farming, you have fishing, you have shellfishing, you have eeling, you have quahogging. There was sheep herding as well.
Very much like a sort of a pastoral lifestyle.
Exactly, yeah. Very pastoral. Very much working the land, and that if you needed to make extra money, maybe you go out whaling if you have a bad year. But it was a community defined by the work they did on the land of that small island. Mm-hmm.
I feel like the word pastoral has sort of a positive connotation, but I can't imagine that it was all that idyllic to be farming on Tuckernuck.
I mean, there were definitely benefits to being out there, but it also would have been tough. And because of that, for the next 150 years, from about 1712 to 1860, Tuckernuck doesn't really change. And I think that Tuckernuck, in many ways, is kind of what Nantucket could have been without whaling. It was barren, but there were resources. It was actually relatively abundant in resources in terms of nature. There was thousands and thousands of birds that still continue to migrate through this part of New England. And in this period, 1700 to about 1860s, it's no exaggeration to say that millions of birds pass through this island. So you have ability to hunt for food. You have immediate access to ocean on all sides. You can fish. The fishing is relatively abundant. Eeling, well, eels themselves are by no means the most delicious food in the world. They can get eels pretty easily, and there are clams and quahogs. And so while it was barren, there was this subtle abundance of nature around you that allowed people to live off of it.
What about resources that aren't coming from the land? Once there's a year-round community on Tuckernuck, how are they sustaining the people there just as a community, as a neighborhood almost?
You do have to have a connection to Nantucket. You can supply a lot yourself. You can farm, you can hunt, but you can't farm everything. You can't get your flour, right? So you have to go to Nantucket to get your flour. You can refill your shotgun shells, but you need more black powder. There was improvement, but it was just much slower. Right? If you keep in mind, during this 1712 to 1860 date that you don't have much change, America changes dramatically. We have a revolution. We decide to become an independent country. We go to war with England then, and then in 1812, we fight the Mexican-American War. We fight a civil war. America industrializes, dozens of presidents, huge sweeping social change. Slavery is abolished. Slavery exists. It's abolished. On Tuckernuck, you can more easily get your shotgun shells. That's the change, really, that you see in the 150 years that we're describing right here.
Sort of an island stuck in time.
If you have to go to Nantucket to get groceries, did they have anything else there in the way of like stores, schools, town infrastructure?
Very little. Almost every house is in this traditional old style way of it is your house, you're in charge of it. What you need, you have to build and take care of. There's no grocery store, there's no police department, there's no fire department. They do build a school. In 1867, they actually float a building from Milk Street here on Nantucket.
They float a building?
They float a building across the channel to Tuckernuck.
Wow.
And put it on sleds and drag it up to Eben Dunham's property, which the town purchased for $10. And they had a school. And the biggest class in that school was the first year it was opened, whopping 14 students.
I guess you would have known everybody in your class.
You would have known everyone in town.
I feel like it's been too long since we've floated a building anywhere.
The last one that I know of is the
Dreamland.
The Dreamland, yeah.
It's been a while.
Been a while, yeah. We could bring that back.
What building do we want to float, you guys?
The Whaling Museum.
Heck yeah. As there's this more sustained year-round community with this school opening up, do you start to see any kind of major shifts in the culture around Tuckernuck?
Well, actually, this moment when the school opens is kind of a turning point for the history of this small island. Actually, the year before, 1866, Tuckernuck sees its first recorded summer resident, and that's Dr. Bigelow.
Dr. Bigelow.
Like the tea?
Like the same spelling, yep, different person. So Dr. Bigelow comes to Tuckernuck. He's a very prestigious doctor from Boston. His house is actually still preserved. It's on the Registry of Historic Places, actually. He was a surgeon. He was actually the first person to give a formal account of the use of anesthesia.
Thank you, Dr. Bigelow.
But he's probably more famous for his work with Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a young railroad worker who was in charge of planting explosives. And he used this long rod to tamp down the charges. When in 1848, it somehow sparked and triggered the black powder, and it sent this tampering rod through his head. Gage miraculously survived, and he actually gets up and walks away from the incident.
As one does.
Ultimately, this accident becomes one of the most famous case studies in American history. And the doctor who Phineas Gage was brought to with this oozing wound in his head and brain sticking out is Dr. Henry Jacob Bigelow. And he's the one that makes that case famous and brings it to national attention. So, pretty influential doctor.
Good on Dr. Bigelow.
If I was Dr. Bigelow, I might run away to Tuckernuck too.
Yep.
That sounds awful.
That's basically what he did. Tuckernuck was a retreat for him. To get away from the hubbub of his life in Boston, of being a surgeon, being a professor, all that work, he could pursue his hobbies out here. He loved hunting, especially birds. And he would come out to Tuckernuck, and him and his son would hunt, and they both loved photography, and they would take photographs out here. And we have some of those photographs in our collection, actually.
Very cool. How did the more permanent residents receive Dr. Bigelow?
They could not have been more different. I think a great example of this is his relationship with a local named Cochran Dunham. And the two of them just were complete opposites in every way imaginable. So Bigelow first arrived in 1866. For 5 years, he rents a place and hunts and spends his time out here on Tuckernuck. In 1871, he decides to build a lodge. He hires local Cochran Dunham to be his caretaker and boatsman while he's here, and the relationship just falls apart almost immediately. Cochran he's this working man who works the land of Tuckernuck on the windswept island, who has grown up there. He's a whaler by trade. He's the definition of a blue-collar worker, works for every cent of money he had. Bigelow white-collar, prestigious doctor. A historian wrote that Dunham probably saw him as, quote, a dandy who acquired assistance in spending his money. Just cut from very different cloths, the two of them.
They went together like peanut butter and vinegar.
And there's the food comment for this month.
Yeah, exactly. Never heard that expression before, but sure, yeah.
I coined it right now.
And very quickly, the relationship just deteriorates. When Dr. Bigelow starts building his lodge, he asks Dunham to procure first-rate cedar shingles for the building. Well, Dunham goes and purchases third-rate shingles and pockets the difference between them. Now, he, as a, quote, dandy, he didn't think that Dr. Bigelow would know the difference, but when they arrived, they were full of knots and have holes in them. And when Bigelow protested, Dunham creatively said, oh, no, the knots make it stronger, and the holes allow better ventilation in the summer.
Oh, naturally.
Naturally, of course. Now, Dr. Bigelow didn't buy that for a second, and then would fire Dunham almost immediately.
What happened next?
Well, Dunham went on a campaign to make Dr. Bigelow's life as annoying as possible while he was on Tuckernuck, really trying to drive him off of the island. He initially nailed shut the gate to Bigelow's property. That didn't seem to annoy Bigelow enough, and so he went after the reason that Bigelow comes out there, and that's to interrupt his hunting. And so when Dr. Bigelow would go out in the morning, perhaps with his son, he would tuck away in a hunting blind, waiting for the birds to get ever closer within range of his gun. And right at that moment, when they were just close enough that he would start to think about lifting that gun up to his shoulder and take the shot, that'd be a perfect opportunity for the other man, the other local, Cochran Dunham, who was waiting patiently as well for those birds to get closer, to pick up the reins, urge his beast on, and boisterously and loudly rumble through the dirt roads of Tuckernuck, loudly scaring away all the birds within range. I mean, it wasn't altruistic. He wasn't trying to save the birds. He was a former whaler, of course, himself, but he really just wanted to annoy Bigelow as much as possible to get him off the island.
Can I just say this would make a great period drama?
Oh my God, yeah. Get PBS on it now. Ultimately, all this annoyance doesn't urge Bigelow off the island. Instead of leaving, the Boston doctor gets his lawyers involved and sued Dunham. The court ruled in favor of the Boston doctor, and Dunham was forced to pay $406 plus legal fees and convey 25 acres and half of his farm to Dr. Bigelow.
Oh, that's a bummer.
Ultimately didn't work out well for the local.
I'm sure Bigelow was not the last summer visitor to Tuckernuck. Was this sort of the first of a wave, a trend of summer visitors?
No, Dr. Bigelow may have been the first summer resident, but he was far from the last. Dr. Bigelow and his son, William Sturgis, would return to Tuckernuck for years, and they invited and shared their remote retreat with friends, including the famed Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and his son as well. But in many ways, the Bigelows opened a can of worms. The birds were easy hunting. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. And Tuckernuck was not about tackling a challenge. It was about finding a place to get away from the hubbub of life in cities and pass time with the guys. There evidently was a decent number of visitors besides the Bigelows, because in the 1880s, a hotel was built on the east end of the island looking towards Nantucket. It was called the Eastview Hotel, and it wouldn't last until the end of the century, but it showed that there was a level of visitation that justified building a hotel.
So if we're shooting fish in a barrel with all these birds, that doesn't sound good for the birds.
No, it is not good for the birds at all. As early as 1927, staples of the bird population like the Eskimo curlew are no longer returning to the island, and people are noticing that. And you have more people coming, gun technology is improving. You're not only using muzzle loaders anymore, so you can have multiple rounds, so you can just keep going. There are regulations in 1918 of the Migratory Bird Act, which protects migratory birds. But on Tuckernuck, it's not like you have a police officer there. And so hunting regulations are pretty widely ignored at the beginning of the 20th century. You have greater connectivity. In 1934, a few duck hunters arrived on Tuckernuck by plane, marking a whole new way for hunters to arrive on the island. Boat technology is improving. You have power boats that cut through the Nantucket Channel a bit easier. And so you have more people going to hunt more birds with better gun technology. It adds up to fewer birds.
By the early 20th century, are people still living there year-round?
No, not really. By the turn of the 20th century, there are fewer and fewer people willing to brave a Tuckernuck winter. There are people who do spend most of the year out there, but the community itself stops being year-round by about 1900.
Are people still going out there for the summers?
Sometimes, yeah. But Tuckernuck stays more as a hunting retreat, not for off-islanders, but those who live on Nantucket still have property on Tuckernuck. Edward Wayman Coffin, an author I relied on heavily for this episode, wrote that, quote, his father's ability to keep us fed in the winter with a shotgun, eel spear, and quahog rake was common to many families on Nantucket Island in the 1930s. His 12-gauge barrels were kept warm through most of the season, punching lead shot into migratory ducks.
In the 1930s, that's way after the Migratory Bird Act.
No, you're correct. In fact, his father was actually arrested for catching illegal ducks, so some of the hunting on Tuckernuck is definitely illegal. But that's part of the draw of Tuckernuck. The lack of enforcement gives you a lot more freedom to do things that you can't do on Nantucket.
I would imagine so.
And it circles all the way back to this conversation about the Wampanoag we started with, right?
Escaping the long arm of the Nantucket law.
But ultimately in the 1930s, the police recognize this and start sending more enforcement agents over, much to the chagrin of many Tuckernuckers. They were very unhappy with it. But it did in some ways protect a lot of the birds out there, black ducks and some of the plovers.
Nowadays, that's really turned around, right? I know that the Tuckernuck Land Trust is a great organization that has been protecting species like that.
No, well said. It is almost a complete 180. And the Land Trust is very proactive in protecting the land and animals out there. But the residents who have property on Tuckernuck are very protective of their island. There's this great story that E.W. Coffin records of his father when he was on Tuckernuck. He saw two men in a skiff eeling on Tuckernuck from his window. Enraged that people were on the island taking what he thought as his eels, he grabbed his shotgun, went to the water's edge, and in a way kind of reminiscent of Cochrane Dunham, he started coincidentally only shooting the birds directly over the head or between himself and the two men in the skiff. You can imagine that they turned around pretty quick and returned back to Nantucket.
In a way that's similar to the mentality that you see on Tuckernuck today, I think.
Yeah, I mean, starting in about this time, as you start seeing this development of Tuckernuck as this retreat and this personal retreat from Nantucket. To quote E.W. Coffin one more time, starting in the 1930s, Tuckernuck became, quote, a place of retreat from the Nantucket throngs and a change of pace from the daily job. And those who live there, they're fiercely proud of it. It's the isolation, the lack of tourists that keep it special. Getting to experience the rawness of Tuckernuck is a privilege. Its exclusiveness keeps it special to those who are there, and its inaccessibility keeps it mysterious to those who aren't.
A little bit like Nantucket for Nantucketers.
It feels like in many ways, like you said, Tuckernuck is like a microcosm of Nantucket in that it is both the most beautiful that Nantucket could be and also perhaps could be the most stormy or the most foggy or it's just more, right?
Yes.
It's Nantucket plus almost. There's a quote that I found in an old issue of one of our magazines, Historic Nantucket, which I feel really hits on why Tuckernuck is such a topic of fascination and mystery. It involves the legend that Captain Kidd once visited the island. The dear Isle of Tuckernuck is full of mystery. That's why people love it so. When the whistling winds blow over the low hills of sand dunes, those who have the right ear, as all true Tuckernuckers have, can catch an echo of a far-off murmur of pointed firs in the northern forests. Birds of passage, welcome messengers from sunny southern lands, as they hover on poised wings, find a resting place here on a sandy beach. The strong nor'westers blowing in bring unknown odors from the sea. Strange flowers turn their merry faces to sunlit heavens, and beneath the sunken blue rock where Captain Kidd buried his secret Spanish gold, deep rumblings are heard.
I feel like that really captures though a lot of what we've been talking about. Tuckernuck being this place where the best of the best meets the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And oftentimes those are the same thing. On that note, we'll take a pause. And when we come back, We'll be talking with Susie Robinson, former president of the Tuckernuck Land Trust and longtime resident of Tuckernuck. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to the Nantucket Gam. I'm Annalie, and today we're joined by Susie Robinson, a third-generation Tuckernuck resident. She is the former president of the Tuckernuck Land Trust, and as a child, she published an island newspaper called the Tuckernuck Foghorn. Thomas and I had the privilege of sitting down with Susie to ask her about her insights into the culture of this mysterious and beautiful place, if she's ever seen the Yoho, and a few personal stories and memories of her childhood spent on Tuckernuck, a place where she first set foot in 1957 when she was 6 years old.
And the minute I stepped foot on the island, I was loving it.
Even at 6 years old?
Yeah. I liked the fact that it was an island and that it was, far away from everything else. And, and it just had a very nice feel to it. We came over on the ferry and then went to Nantucket, and Walter Barrett brought us over.
Oh, so you weren't even on Nantucket, actually. You almost directly went to Tuckernuck.
Yeah. Well, my grandmother grew up on Tuckernuck.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so she inherited that house. It's not the house that she grew up in. It was her grandfather's house. Her father built a house nearby, and when, her parents and all died, she had the choice of, either of the houses. And she chose the one that we have now because it was on 8.2 acres of land, whereas the one that she grew up in was on just a postage stamp. And all, that house is much older. So they had to renovate it. It had been left empty for years. The part of the roof had caved in, and anyway, so it was a big job.
So you've been going to Tuckernuck since you were 6. Have you been going annually?
Every year, but 1975, because I was living in England.
How long do you typically stay on Tuckernuck?
In recent years, I've spent the whole summer. When I was a kid, I pretty much spent the whole summer too, because we would go over and spend time with my grandparents, and then my parents would come over and my grandparents would leave.
And what would you do over there?
Did all kinds of things. We went beachcombing and a bit of fishing and picnicking and just exploring and playing with boats. And we had a place called Shell Harbor where we had our boats. It was a place where a bunch of big rocks had been put into the water and we would go there and play with our boats there. And we each had our own little island, which was a rock. I mean, there was big boulders, and we played there for hours. We went beachcombing a lot, looked for treasures on the beach.
It sounds like a blast. I can only imagine being a young kid.
It was idyllic, looking back on it. At the time I just thought that was life. But looking back on it now, I feel how lucky I am to have had that experience.
It makes me think of the picture book One Morning in Maine by Robert McCloskey.
Yes.
Where, the whole picture book is they're out clamming, and then they take their boat over to go to the hardware store and get ice cream.
Did you ever read Time of Wonder?
Yes.
That's even better, I think. Yeah. And we've been there through hurricanes and.
Well, I was gonna say there was this kind of idyllicness to it, but life on Tuckernuck, I imagine, can also be pretty rough. Living through hurricanes on that island, there's not much to protect you on that island in terms of landscape and geography.
Well, our house is kind of in the middle of the island, so it's a bit more protected than some of them. But the house would creak and groan, and the wind would whistle outside.
Does it get nerve-wracking making sure that you have access to food? Because I know on Nantucket, sometimes in the winter, when the winds get really strong and the boats stop running, people get kind of nervous.
Well, over the years, we've been really good about, making lists and making sure that we get everything we need. And also, there are neighbors over there that you can always go to for help if you need something, or forgot the butter or something like that.
You mentioned Walter Baylor, and his service was called the Yoho service, or
yes,
what was it?
Yoho service, yeah.
Did you use that regularly to get everything over when you were living there?
Yes. Well, when I was a kid, he brought everything over, including the mail.
Including the mail?
Yeah. Yeah.
Was he an official U.S. mail service?
I don't know how that worked out, because at one point I asked somebody at the post office if I or somebody else could deliver mail over there, and they said no. So, but he brought it. He brought, our summer weekly readers and the funnies that my parents would send over when we were there with my grandparents, and all the mail.
Well, speaking of weekly readers and mail, you yourself had a little stint as a publisher, did you not?
Yes. Yeah. My brother and I printed a paper called the Tuckernuck Foghorn.
When I was researching this, I had the pleasure of finding...
Did you find them?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good.
And the gelatin prints, right? They're not printed. You used...
we used what's called a hectograph board.
Hectograph, thank you. I forgot the word.
Yes. It's a tray with some kind of gelatin in it, yeah.
What inspired you to do that? How old were you when you were doing that?
I think we started when I was 9 or 10, and we did it for about 5 or 6 years. What inspired? I had the idea to do it, and my grandmother was a teacher, and so she thought that was a great idea for us to do, and so she underwrote it and encouraged us.
How did you distribute them?
By bicycle.
By bicycle?
Yeah.
So you would hop on your bike and you would go house to house?
Yeah. I went on Wednesdays around the island and collected news, and then my brother was the editor. He put it together, and we printed the first side on Friday and the second side on Sunday morning, and then I went on the bike again and distributed the papers.
How many copies would you make for each edition?
It depended on the time of the summer. I think the most we ever did was like 75.
That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, around Labor Day and 4th of July, there were, a fair amount of people on the island.
Would any of those copies make their way over to Nantucket, or did they just stay on Tuckernuck?
Yes, some of them did. I don't know. Laurel Stackpole was actually the wife of one of the editors of the Enquirer and Mirror back in the day, and she would come over and visit a friend of hers who lived on Tuckernuck, and she came over, and Sidney Coffin was the friend of hers, and she would send copies to various people, and she insisted on paying 25 cents a copy for the Foghorn, because that's what she paid for the Enquirer and Mirror.
Did you charge people on Tuckernuck for it?
No, we did not. People, some people paid and some people didn't. And Ellis Taylor paid us in fudge. She made fudge and panucci, and she would give us some of that sometimes.
That sounds like a pretty good payment to me.
Yeah, it was delicious.
Probably better than 25 cents if you were 10 years old.
Yeah.
There's no grocery stores. There's not even any paved roads on Tuckernuck.
Right.
How do you actually get stuff like groceries or building material to the island personally today?
Well, personally, right now, my daughter comes over on the weekends. Kat Robinson Greeter is her name. And she comes over on the weekends and brings food and clean laundry.
So you don't even do your own laundry out there?
No, but we used to. We have a Ringer washer over there that
really?
we used to use once a week, yeah. I don't run my boat anymore, she does. But when I was running my boat, I would go, to town once a week and get what I needed and go back.
Have you seen the island itself, Tuckernuck, fundamentally change throughout the years you've been going there?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Tremendously. We've lost so much land on the south side of the island. I would say maybe a quarter to a third of the island has disappeared.
That much?
Wow.
Yeah. There used to be a landing strip on the south shore, and it's all gone. I mean, it was two landing strips, that crossed each other, and there's just one little remnant of the north-south runway left, and the rest is completely gone.
That's pretty incredible.
It is. It's scary, because up at the west head, it's almost it's in a few years it might break through into the North Pond, and that would be just, I don't know what would happen then. Yeah.
We had this conversation, Annalie, Adam, and I, that on Nantucket, erosion is very evident. You can see it all over the island, and there's conversations about it. There's preventative measures being taken that you can see.
Yeah.
But even in my limited experience with Tuckernuck, you really see it almost changing before your eyes. And it's not just erosion and a little bit being worn away. It's fundamentally changing the geography of the island.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember when I was first there as a small child, you could still see the shoal that was the remnants of Smith's Point going way out beyond Tuckernuck. And that kind of sheltered the South Shore, but that's all gone now. And so the Atlantic Ocean just beats against the South Shore and is taking its toll.
Do you think there's going to be a day where Tuckernuck is no longer?
Yeah. If things keep going the way they are. I don't think we have to worry about our house in my lifetime or my daughter's lifetime, but yeah.
Well, speaking of land, I'm going to pivot a little bit. I'm going to talk about the Tuckernuck Land Trust.
Yeah.
You were formerly the president, correct?
I was at one time, yeah. I was a founding member.
What propagated that? Was it an attempt to maintain space on Tuckernuck or to limit construction?
To maintain open space and the ecology, because when you start building houses, it damages all that.
Was that a problem that you were facing, that there was a construction boom that was threatening that?
Yes, kind of, yeah. I mean, I think there are twice as many houses as there were when I was a child.
Really?
Yeah.
And how many houses are there now?
I think there are 37 houses now.
So when you were a child, there were only, 18, 20 or so?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it changed the feeling of the island a lot.
Well, that's... with 18 houses, you probably knew almost everyone around you growing up.
Absolutely. Especially when we started printing the paper.
Oh, I'm sure.
We got to know everybody. Well, there was a part of the island on the North Shore that was kind of taboo, where the Finney Taylor family was. And I remember going over the hill there the first time with some trepidation when we went around with a letter to give to people to say that we'd like to do a newspaper, and if they asking if they would contribute. But they were so nice, and they've become like family. So
even with more houses than you've seen before, do you feel like there's still a really strong community on Tuckernuck between all the people living there?
Well, with the older families, definitely. The newer people, they don't, a lot of them, they don't get it in a way. Yeah.
I mean, when you say older families, do any names come to mind?
Well, the Coffins and the Dunhams and the Taylors, the Finneys, those families.
Are the Lafarges?
Lafarges, yes. Yeah, they would be included in that for sure.
Are there any Bigelows still on the island?
No Bigelows. There haven't been any Bigelows for a long time.
I assume you know the story of Dr. Bigelow. And
oh, yeah.
What does that invoke anything in your view of this moment in time for when, 1880s?
Well, that was a very different time on the island, and his house went over the bank.
Really?
Yeah, there are two buildings that are still standing, and the Lafarges moved them to the east end of the island to the property that they bought, and incorporated them into an existing house there. Yeah.
Is there a standing fire department?
I know, it's all volunteer.
So how does that work in practice? Say there was a fire.
Not very well right now. Because the guy who was kind of in charge retired, and nobody's kind of taken it over. So
when you say volunteer, you mean that there are people who are essentially on call, and if a fire breaks out...
Well, if a fire breaks out, everybody on the island turns out. I mean, that hasn't happened very often in my lifetime. There was a fire in about 1982 or so where a tree got struck by lightning, actually very near where the field station is. and it smoldered all day, and then it kind of took off, and we were able to get it out without getting the Nantucket people over. So it was crazy, though.
And you weren't directly involved in that?
Oh, I was there, yeah. But it was a circus.
Oh, I'm sure.
There were so many people there and little kids running around. And yeah.
It's funny, in our very first episode that we did, we did an episode about the Great Fire of 1846.
Oh, wow.
And we actually talk about some of the fires that lead up to it.
Yeah.
And in 1836, they talk about how firefighting was done. And one of it is exactly what you're describing, this community effort of there being, this relatively loosely established fire company, in this case, the volunteers, and then the community effort that come together and put out the fire. And
right.
I think in some ways, Tuckernuck's draw and its lore, especially amongst those of us who don't live out there, is that it is kind of this place that seems to be stuck in time in a way. That it's a way to escape a lot of the hubbub and the modernity of Nantucket, especially as our tourist economy just gets fuller and fuller each year. Tuckernuck remains elusive in that ability to escape that.
Yeah. It's just lovely to go over there and have the quiet. And no traffic to speak of, and it's just a simpler lifestyle. We don't have a TV. We have a radio. We listen to NPR. Some people do have TVs. They have, satellite dishes. But I'm not interested in that.
Well, if anyone wants anything to listen to, I know a great podcast about Nantucket history they could tune into. Maybe they can hear a local on it with them.
Right.
Today, it's very difficult for a person to get to Tuckernuck because the entire island is privately held, correct?
Well, that's always been that way.
Has there ever been an attempt to, bring the public in a way and share some of the island with them?
Not really. I mean, when I kind of liken it to, when somebody makes a stink about it being all private property, I say to them, well, how would you like it if I walked right through your yard, on Nantucket? Because that's what it's all about over there, I wouldn't mind so much if people came over if they respected things, but they don't. I mean, some people do, but some people don't, and that's... there's been some vandalism over there from time to time, and I'm always really afraid that somebody will start a fire by dropping a cigarette and not being careful with it. That's my main fear about people coming over.
I have kind of a silly question.
That's okay.
My family's favorite Tuckernuck story is actually in Nantucket Harbor. My parents were in a boat, and the gas to the engine cut off. And they see someone else in a motorboat, and they ask for help. Yeah. And he says with great urgency, no, I have to get this washing machine to Tuckernuck. And I have to know why that would be such an urgent need.
I think I know who it is, and I think...
Can you say the name?
No.
Okay.
But he probably just didn't want to bother. He was intent on, doing what he was doing.
My parents have been telling that story over and over
That's
my whole
really
life.
Funny. There aren't too many houses that actually have washing machines over there.
Well, I got one last question for you. And this is a very important question. Have you ever seen the Tuckernuck Yoho?
Well, yes.
You have?
Well, I've seen the statue.
Oh, yes, the statue. But
Have you experienced it without seeing it?
Well, the reason the Tuckernuck Yoho came into being there was because families living there didn't want their kids to go to the beach and, go in the water and stuff like that. So they would say, don't go there, the Yoho will get you,
But it originally came from a poem by Richard Hurd.
Well, I think the actual origin of the Yoho is from the fishermen that were fishing on the Georges banks, that they would get disoriented in the fog and they would have hallucinations. So I think that's really the basis of the Yoho. But the Tuckernuckers took it up in a big way.
Well, Susie Robinson, thank you so much for joining us. Tuckernuck remains this mysterious island off the coast of Nantucket, but it's been an absolute pleasure to have had you shed a little bit of light onto it for us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Really wonderful to talk to you.
You're welcome.
Well, take care. Be well.
Thanks, you too.
For more information, head to nha.org or check out the show notes. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalee Gilbert Keith. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket Gam is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. Thanks for listening.